The Other Side, Episode 8. Welcome back, everybody. This is Mr. Margison. This is actually my third recording of this episode, so if you've gotten an alert 3 times, that's not a mistake. Well, they're my mistakes. First one, I got interrupted. Second one, I listened back and I didn't like the sound quality, so I'm trying to give you guys the best. So we're redoing it again. Okay. February 2016, we are right in the beginning of election season. Polling from the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries show that voters age 30 and under turn out for Bernie Sanders in absolutely staggering numbers. More than 80% of that demographic preferred Sanders for president. That same month, a survey showed that college-age millennials, so age 18 to 24, had a favorable view of socialism. They were the only demographic to do so. And that among them, socialism beats capitalism as the economic system of choice by double digits. About 11% more millennials preferred socialism than capitalism. Now, last week we actually talked about Bernie Sanders, a self-described socialist, and we talked about his socialist prescription for healthcare in the United States, and we used 3 basic economic principles to explain why Sanders' prescription of free healthcare wouldn't really work. And just as a quick review, we talked about the fact that healthcare requires factors of production, that factors of production are scarce and have alternative uses, therefore they incur costs, and that the basic principles of supply and demand would dictate that those costs would go up when a third party, like the government, managed those transactions. So this actually segues nicely into our topic today, which is which economic system should the United States use? Clearly, millennials believe that we should use a socialist system. And what we're going to do today is we are going to honestly and openly debate the merits of both systems and see if we can't come to a compromise at the end, some sort of compromise between the two. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. We are going to talk about why socialism sucks, why capitalism is far superior, and as kind of a side gift, I'm going to give you pointers on how you can beat back anti-capitalist arguments when you hear them. If you are in some sort of debate with a millennial socialist, how do you argue them when they are telling you capitalism is the worst? We're going to go over that. Just as a quick answer to that, if you stick to 2 things, history and economics, socialist arguments usually ignore those 2 things. So if you stick to those 2 things, you will find these debates much easier to win. But here's how today's episode is going to be structured. I am going to take 3 anti-capitalist arguments, and these are not anti-capitalist arguments that I am making up. These are arguments that I have heard or read or listened to. They've been presented to me in some way, shape, or form, and we are going to debate them. So first argument is that as an institution, capitalism promotes evil, greed, inequality, poverty, crime. Basically all of the worst human behaviors you can imagine are promoted under a capitalist system. Right? The second argument is that income inequality is the biggest threat to humankind. That's actually kind of a difficult one because on the left, the biggest threat to humankind changes almost weekly. Sometimes it's global warming, sometimes it's inequality, sometimes it's Islamophobia. But the World Economic Forum they are a leftist organization, and they have labeled income inequality as the biggest threat to humankind for like the last 8 years or something like that. So that's argument number 2. We're going to debate that. And argument number three is that Scandinavia is the shining beacon of socialist light that we in the United States need to look to in order to become a successful socialist nation. If we just look at the countries of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland and what they do, we too can be successful socialist economies. So those are the three arguments, and we're going to tear them apart right now. So let's go to number one. And number one, again, is that as an institution, right, as an economic system, capitalism promotes evil, greed, inequality, poverty, crime. And listen, if you are a Marxist or an anti-capitalist and you're listening to this and I've misrepresented these arguments at all, please get in touch with us. You can email us at margisonandspears@gmail.com, or you can address me on Twitter. It's at Mr. Margison. But I want to make sure that I am not misrepresenting your arguments as well. Again, these are arguments that either have been presented to me directly or arguments that I have read or heard at some point. But so, as an institution, capitalism promotes evil, greed, inequality, poverty, crime, all the worst human behaviors. They grow or are promoted or accentuated under a capitalist system. Well, this one is actually really, really easy to debate. And if you're listening and you do find yourself in debates over economic systems from time to time with your peers, this is the easiest one to destroy, because if that's true, if capitalism is responsible for all of these behaviors, these ills in society, then we should be able to go back to a time prior to capitalism and see maybe not an elimination of these behaviors, but much, much less greed, much, much less inequality, much less poverty than we do in post-capitalist life. And here's the way that I argue when I'm presented with this, or if I'm debating an anti-capitalist. I simply say, okay, describe pre-capitalist life for me. And then you can just kind of sit back and watch the show, because it's actually very entertaining. One of the reasons is because millennial Marxists don't read history, they read BuzzFeed. Right? So if you just ask them, okay, describe pre-capitalist life, what was that like? You're going to get a lot of stuttering or just silence. But I will describe pre-capitalist life to you. It was terrible. And by pre-capitalist, we have to date capitalism somewhere. And different people use different dates, but some pick post-Civil War, so like 1870 and beyond, when the Industrial Revolution really took hold. That's usually the most common starting place for capitalism, is the start of the Industrial Revolution. And so we're talking post-Civil War in the United States, 1870 and beyond, a little bit earlier in England, but around that time period. Some people date it even earlier to the publishing of Adam Smith's book called The Wealth of Nations, really the very first volume on capitalist economic theory. That was published, I believe, in 1775. But if we're going to talk about pre-capitalist society, it would have to be sometime before then. All right, so let's get into the 1600s and before, the Middle Ages in Europe. Okay, so in the Middle Ages in Europe, was there less greed, less poverty, less inequality, less crime? Absolutely not. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Well, if you just want a quick world history refresher, let me describe to you what medieval life was like, not only in Europe, but these same structures in society existed all the way across to Asia. Most people lived under what was called a feudal structure, and in a feudal structure, you basically had rigid social classes. So at the top, they sometimes refer to it as a pyramid, a feudal pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, the most narrow part of society, you would have a king or a monarch or an emperor or somebody who was in charge of making all the economic decisions. Underneath them, you would have, the names vary, but it's lords or barons or the landowners, the people who held wealth. After that, as you get to the bottom of the period, the widest part, the vast majority of the populations, they were serfs, they were peasants. Right? They were slaves. They had no freedom, and they had absolutely no wealth. So this is how society was structured in pre-capitalist times. The very vast majority of people lived in absolute wretched conditions, absolutely terrible conditions. And who was at the top of the pyramid? Those were the people who had the wealth. All right, we're talking, I'm going to overshoot here. We're going to say that's 5% of the population. And I don't know the exact percentage, but I know that 5% is way too high. So the point is 95% of the people in pre-capitalist times lived in absolute misery and absolute poverty. And all of the wealth in society was concentrated in the top 5%. In other words, to say that capitalism creates inequality is absolute nonsense. There was much, much more inequality in pre-capitalist life than there was in post-capitalist life. And let's look at poverty. Okay, well, so what's happened to poverty as a result of capitalism? If anti-capitalists argue that capitalism creates poverty, let's just look at statistics and see if that's true. The resource that I'm using here, it's a fantastic resource. It's called Our World in Data, and it's not any type of bias partisan organization. It's just data, and that's what they collect. And what I'm going to read to you here is the percentage of people who are living in extreme poverty. And this was a study that was done by two economists, and they had to try and they're able to use data that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And what they do is they try and simulate, what life would be like, what economic measures that we use today might be like in medieval times. I know that's kind of confusing, but here's the point. Here's all you need to know. I didn't need to tell you that. The percentage of people, according to this study, who were living in poverty in the year 1820. All right, so we're going to go to before the Industrial Revolution, before capitalism really took hold in the Western world. You have about 94% of the population is living in poverty, right? Living in extreme poverty, 85%. Okay, huge majorities of people are living in poverty or extreme poverty. Let's take ourselves through the 1800s and through the Industrial Revolutions into the year 2000. What is the percentage of people who are living in extreme poverty? 24%. That is unbelievable. We go all the way to the year 2000. The percentage of people who are living in extreme poverty has declined over the course of capitalist life from about 85 to 95%, depending upon which measures you use, down to 25%. So the idea that capitalism has created poverty, no, as Ayn Rand said, and she said this beautifully, capitalism did not create poverty, it inherited it. And I would actually go a step forward and say that it cured it. Because and keep in mind that between 1820 and the year 2000, we have added billions and billions of people to this planet. Population in 1820 was about a billion, about 1. Now we're over 7. So we've added 6 billion people in that time. And those people are not living in poverty as the vast majority of people used to. They are out of poverty. They have decent lives, right? Middle class or better lives. Okay, what do I mean by decent lives? I got to get into that a little bit. And I'm going to focus here on the United States because that's what I have data from. What we're going to look at is modern amenities, right? And I'm going to use appliances as my metric here. But this is just to prove that in capitalist society, sometimes you often hear people say, anti-capitalists will say something along the lines of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that is, maybe they say it because it's catchy, but nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing is further from reality than the idea that the poor have gotten poorer. As I just showed you with that statistic, the number of poor people in this country, not only has a percentage of poor people dropped, but the raw numbers of poor people is far lower than it ever had been before. But we're going to look at modern amenities and things that we take for granted now that 50 years ago people didn't have, or if you did have them, you had to be rich. So things like washing machine, a dryer, a dishwasher, a refrigerator, freezer, stove, microwave, television, personal computer, cellular phone, air conditioning. These are things that if you lived, post World War II, you own them if you were wealthy, right? These are things that were reserved for the wealthy class. But here's how it works in a capitalist society. Competition actually makes these products better, and it makes them cheaper over time, so that things that were once only available to the rich are now available to everybody. So let's look at, my data only goes up to 2005, so these numbers would be even better now than they were in 2005. But the percentage of households that own these amenities in 2005, and percentage of poor households that own these amenities in 2005. Poor households who own a washing machine, 70%, clothes dryer, 60%, dishwasher, 36%, refrigerator, 99%, freezer, 25%, stove, 97%, microwave, 91%, TV, 97%, phone, 79%, air conditioner, 79%, cellular telephone, this is in 2005, 50%. You can imagine what that number is now. What the point is that far from the idea that the poor get poorer under capitalism, the poor get much richer. Those were all amenities that at one time were only reserved for the wealthy. But as I said, in capitalist systems where producers have to compete in order to make money, they make the products cheaper, they make them more widely available, they make them better, and now we live in a society where the poor people in America have these things, these amenities. Where even middle-class people in other countries do not. Okay, anything else here on argument number one that, I'm going through my notes, anything else here than argument number one that capitalism promotes all these terrible things? Let's see, we've talked about that. I think we hit it. Oh, there is one thing that I want to talk about. This is, being a history teacher, I come across this a lot. People often, anti-capitalists, often blame child labor on capitalism. And I want to address this argument specifically because you hear about, because of capitalism, you have children that are working in sweatshops. In the United States, this was happening in the early 1900s. Today, it's happening in China. And I want to address this specifically because this is one of the most pernicious lies when it comes to capitalism. This is so incorrect. First of all, to talk about child labor, to somehow suggest that child labor is a result of capitalism is so stupid. Child labor has existed since the dawn of time. The first children labored. Their children labored, and their children labored. That's all that they could possibly do in order to survive. For vast millennia, that's all children did was labor. Only after capitalism, only after capitalism, statistics show this. So we'll take the United States. Only after capitalist institutions were brought to the United States did parents make enough money working in a factory or working in something other than just agricultural work. Were they able to make enough money to not only feed and sustain life for their family, but to also educate their kids? And then when kids get educated, the next generation has more skills and more knowledge. That's why over the last 100 years, technology has just taken off the way that it has. Because children are no longer laboring. So far from being the cause of child labor, that is such nonsense. Child labor was the norm in every society for most of history. And it's now been eliminated only in nations where capitalism is the economic institution. I did want to hit that, and I almost skipped over it. Okay, I've spent a lot of time on that. I really got to go forward here. I'm going to go quickly on this next one. Argument number two is that income inequality is the greatest threat to humankind. And I'm going to go through this quickly just by giving you an example. I want to talk about how irrelevant inequality by itself is. Inequality is just a function of numbers. It's a function of math. So let's look at this, and I'm going to use whole numbers here. These are not supposed to be accurate, but we're going to imagine there is a society with three classes: a lower class, a middle class, and an upper class. The lower class makes $5,000 a year, the middle class makes $10,000 a year, the upper class makes $15,000 a year. We're just using nice, easy, round numbers to prove a point. Now, let's suppose that in this society, over the next decade, wealth quadrupled. The economy quadrupled. And not just for the rich, it quadrupled for everybody, right? That would be an astounding economic miracle, right? I mean, if wealth doubled and then doubled again, that would be unheard of economically. And I think no matter whether you're on the right or the left, you would have to agree that that is a positive thing. So each of the income classes see their incomes quadruple over a decade. Well, what you would see is you would see inequality increase greatly, right? So at the beginning, you have the poor people making $5,000, middle class making $10,000, rich people making $15,000. Their wealth quadruples, and at the end of the decade, the poor people are making $20,000, the middle class people are making $40,000, and the wealthy people are making $60,000. So let's look at the gaps between the poor and the rich. It's gotten much, much wider, right? Previously, it was $10,000, the rich making $15,000, the poor making $5,000. Now it's $40,000, rich making $60,000, the poor making $20,000. Is that really a problem? Why is that the thing that we have chosen to obsess over? Why on the left, why do Marxists and anti-capitalists ignore the fact that the income of the poor went from $5,000 to $20,000 and just simply focus on the difference between what the poor are making and what the rich are making? In any society, isn't the point to make sure that the poor are doing better? And look, while the numbers aren't exactly the same, the situation that I've just described to you is exactly what has happened in the United States over the past half century, quarter century. Conditions have improved greatly, not just for the wealthy. Yes, the wealthy, we have seen their incomes go up, and it is true that as a percentage of national wealth, the wealthy are actually doing better, and that occurred over Barack Obama's presidency. Right, the wealthy actually got a larger share of the national income, but what's more important is that if we go back over the past 30 years, poor people are making more money and they have more access to more goods, as we just showed in the point during argument number one. They have more access to more goods that improve their standard of life, that improve their quality of life and standard of living. And shouldn't that really be the point? I mean, why is income inequality the focus? Why is that the greatest threat to humankind when poor people are seeing their lives improve, right? Or people living in absolute poverty, those numbers are declining greatly. Why are we focused on the gap? That's my look. Income inequality, that's something that we're going to do in another episode when we talk about why economies need the rich. So I'm going to cut that one kind of short, but inequality, it's a function of numbers. All right, what should be focused on is the fact that the poor do better. Okay, let's go to argument number 3 real quick. This is on Scandinavia, and let me just tell you that Scandinavia is not all it's cracked up to be. And you don't hear that much more about Scandinavia anymore, and I'll tell you why. Because after people on the left dug in and did a little bit of research onto it, they also found out that Scandinavia is not really all that it's cracked up to be. What you saw was during the presidential campaign, Bernie Sanders specifically mentioned Denmark as kind of an example of what the United States should be like, and Sanders being a self-described socialist, this actually ticked off the Prime Minister of Denmark, who had to come out and say, look, he is wrong. We are not a socialist economy, and that is true. These Scandinavian countries are not socialist economies. Every anti-capitalist who said that we need to be more like Sweden or we need to be more like Denmark is simply incorrect, saying that they're socialist economies. They're not. They're very capitalist economies. In fact, in many ways, they are much more capitalist than the United States. And if this is what the left wants, hey, I would be all for it. The Heritage Foundation does an index of economic freedom. You should look at it. It's really fantastic. But they measure economic freedom for all nations, and they assign a score to them. And these Scandinavian countries score higher in economic freedom when it comes to businesses and corporations than to the United States. In other words, there are fewer regulations on businesses and fewer regulations on corporations in Scandinavia than there are here in the United States. I mean, imagine that if you're a leftist. The leftists hate business in this country. They hate corporations. They demand that they be regulated and regulated more heavily. Yet, if you go over to a Scandinavian nation, you can start up a business with far fewer obstacles and far fewer red tape than you can here. They're simply less regulated. In tax, they're taxed far less. Look at the corporate tax rate between corporations in the United States and corporations in Scandinavia. 39% is the corporate tax rate here in the United States, 22% in Sweden, 27% in Norway, 24% in Denmark. I mean, that kind of speaks for itself. They are not socialists. They're actually very free. Now, what they are is they are heavily taxed from a personal income standpoint. All right, individuals have to pay much higher taxes in Scandinavia than they do here in the United States. And I tell you what, that also is not all it's cracked up to be, because most of those taxes fall on the middle class. They don't fall on the upper class. One of the big maxims of the left here is to tax the rich. That's what they say, tax the rich. Well, if you look at the top marginal tax rate, so the very top income tax rate that the rich pay, when does that kick in? That kicks in the United States at about 8.5 times the average income, right? So take the average income in the United States, multiply it by 8.5, and those are the people who start paying the highest tax rate. All right, so it actually is the rich that we are taxing. In Denmark, when does the top marginal tax rate kick in? It kicks in at 1.2 times the average income. 1.2 times the average income, that's when the top marginal rate kicks in. But not only that, that marginal rate is 50% higher than it is here in the United States. So in the United States, the top marginal tax rate is about 40%. In Denmark, it's 60%. But it's not just the rich who are paying that 60%, it's the middle class. I mean, is that an equitable system? Really? I don't think it is. That's not one that I would want. The business freedom, yeah, it's great. And they have a social safety net in Denmark. But to take on or to task the middle class with carrying that burden, I mean, is that really something that the left wants to advocate? I don't think it would be. There are a number of other. I'm just using Denmark as an example, and we are kind of running short on time here. I don't want this to run over 30 minutes, but there are other things about Scandinavia that aren't so great. Okay, Finland. You want to be like Finland? For a long time, when the international scholastic scores came out and Finland was ranked number 1, the left immediately said we all have to be like Finland. This country, we got to be like Finland. Finland has the third highest gun ownership rate in the world and the highest murder rate in Europe. Is that something that leftists really want? I mean, that's what the Finns do. They get sloshed on vodka and they go out shooting each other. Denmark's got the 4th largest ecological footprint in the world. I mean, our Greenpeace people here wouldn't like that. They're also the highest prescribed when it comes to depression medication, which is unfortunate. So I guess, I mean, that's the trade-off. I don't really see that as an acceptable trade-off. You're going to tax the life out of everybody, then they're depressed and you put them on medication. The point here is, there's lots of other stuff. Norway, they're talking about how they treat immigrants. The Norwegians are often labeled as the most xenophobic in Europe. Let me see if I can see exactly what the words were there. Norwegians are the most insular and xenophobic of all the Scandinavians. This is a report in The Guardian. So, look, We heard this during the 2016. I could go on and on, but we heard this during the 2016 campaign that Scandinavia, these were the countries that we had to be like. A couple of things came out immediately. Number one, they are not socialist economies, and number two, they're not quite all they're cracked up to be. Are they nice countries? Yes, I'm sure that they are. Are they relatively clean and well off? Yeah, nobody's going to argue that. But that's also a lot easier to do when you have small geographic area and only 5 million people, which is about the average of each of those countries. A little bit more difficult when you have 3,000 miles coast to coast and 350 million people. Right? Not quite as easy to socialize then, but that's not something the left likes to talk about. Okay, quick recap. I'm now over 30 minutes, and I apologize for that, but what are the common arguments in favor of socialism? Number one is that capitalism is the cause of all these ugly human behaviors, and we took that apart. If it is the cause, you would easily be able to go back into pre-capitalist times and see a much happier time. In fact, what you see is a much, much worse time, and things only started to get better, not only in the United States, but across the world under capitalism. Number two is that income inequality is the greatest threat to humankind. There is no evidence that it is a threat at all. Yes, there is income inequality, but I have no reasonable expectation that two different people should make the exact same income. Some people differ in their talents, their abilities, their ambitions, their drive, their motivation, their skills, their productivity. It's true that no two humans are the same. Do we have any reasonable expectation that their incomes would be the same? That doesn't make any sense. What's more important is that poor people are better off in this country and other countries. Last is that we need to look to the north, to the east and to the north, to Scandinavia, in order to cure our problems, and because they are the example of socialism that we need to follow. Point is, they're not socialists. They're not socialists at all. They have very, very low regulations on their business. Their corporations pay lower tax rates. No leftists will get behind that. They own guns. They have an ecological footprint. All the things that people on the left in this country would abhor, and that's one of the reasons you don't really hear the left talking about Scandinavia as much as they used to. Okay, I'm going to cut it there. Our next episode I'm looking forward to, I think we're going to do a joint episode, myself and Mr. Spears, talking about the legitimacy of the state. We've been talking about this for a while, and what I'm going to do, he does a great job on that. I'm going to interview him and let him speak. You're really going to get a lot out of that. So pay attention. That should be coming next week. Good talking with you, and remember that your education is not complete until you've heard the other side.